Welcome to this episode of Orthodontics in Interview. Today we've got a great interview lined up with Dr. Grant ISHERWOOD. So I want to explain how this interview has come about. So I was following Grant on social media and I saw some exceptional cases come up. I got into a conversation with Grant and it turns out that he's a recently qualified orthodontist. I was amazed to see his clinical skill. We had a bit of a conversation, and I really wanted to share his experiences as a new orthodontist with you guys as the audience. So, welcome, Grant, to Orthodontics in Interview.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on.
My pleasure. And this time we're going for a video format, so I can't hide behind my notes. So, I'm looking forward to putting this one out there. So, Grant's history. So, Grant is from Glasgow. He did his specialty training at the University of Liverpool in the UK. And he qualified in 2019 from the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh. Grant has been very active during his training and he's published 10 scientific papers, and we'll go into covering some of those as we go through the interview. So Grant, thank you very much for joining me for this Orthodontics in Interview video format.
No problem.
So, as I mentioned, Grant, I've been following you for some time, and what I really want to know is somebody who's recently qualified as an orthodontist, what have been those key experiences in your development as an orthodontist since you qualified 2 years ago?
Well, since qualifying, the scariest thing about qualifying is you have to find a job, I suppose. And the first job that I sort of was approached by a local specialist practitioner, and they sold me the dream, and I really bought into that dream, and it was a fantastic job, and I know you know the area and the practice well, and
Yes.
it was great. I absolutely loved it. So the job basically was in the morning I would treatment plan NHS cases, so I'd have tons of them. The patients would come in to see me. I would treatment plan them all. I would write a prescription for therapists. There was, I think there was 4 therapists at that time, and that was great for me. You can imagine, as a newly graduated orthodontist, you've just got tons of treatment planning practice, really, I suppose, and that was great. So I would do that in the morning, and then I had a bit of experience supervising therapists as well. So that was a sort of string to my bow that I brought in, which was good. I never had that experience before. And in the afternoon, I got to actually get my hands dirty doing some cases, so NHS and private lists in the afternoon. So yeah, it was really good. It was a great job, and that was probably the first sort of key experience for me, because I think when you come out of university, you kind of know what to do, but you don't really know, and you kind of are a bit nervous, and there is nothing like getting rid of those nerves when you see a list of 20 people that are coming to see you, and everyone in the practice is looking at you because you're the boss, and you just think, oh goodness, I need to, sink or swim time. So that was great, and I really sort of jumped into that with 2 feet and loved it. It was really, really good. And then from there, it was quite far away, that practice, otherwise I may still be there right now. So it was a sort of an hour and a half drive to get there, and then an hour and a half home. So I decided I had to find something closer to home, and I have I'm now working in 2 different practices. I've got my own established NHS list, and I work and I treat private patients as well, sort of 5 days a week throughout a small NHS contract too. So the key experiences, I suppose, for me were getting out there, getting a lot of experience as quickly as possible, and then also sort of during that time learning as much as possible. There's so much that the orthodontic curriculum in the UK doesn't teach you, and you can only get that experience by being on the battleground, sort of in a practice, learning off someone that's better than you. Private dentistry, aligners, ceramic brackets. What happens when things go wrong? Complaints, all these kind of things, and looking after therapists and all these kind of things. So it was great. It was a baptism of fire, but I loved it.
Fantastic. That sounds really good. So
Mm.
you went in at the deep end there. You went into both sectors, both the national service, but also into the private sector, and got your skills from there. And I think that's a very good way to look at kind of qualifying. Is that you come out almost like at the end of a river, coming to a delta. You're kind of coming out kind of very charged, and you know what's going on, and then just spreading it wider and gaining the full breadth of the sea in orthodontics. That's fantastic.
Mm.
So, Grant, it has now been a couple of years since you've qualified, but what's kept you motivated? Of course, exams whilst you're doing your registrar training, but what's kept you going in the educational side?
Um, I was talking to one of my bosses recently, and they summed it up nicely when they said that the motivation for them never left them. They just have this innate motivation to do well and to not just be the best that they can be, not be the best necessarily, but to be the best that they can be. And the motivation isn't financial anymore, and it's not sort of egotistical in any way. But it's literally, for me, it's finding those one or two cases, and um, I describe it like, the young patients that we see, they come in with teeth that are like a bag of chips all over the place, and you can literally change their life. And we do that so often. It's just, it's a bit of a slow process, and they're unable to communicate it how appreciative that they are at that time. But seeing young patients, come in and they're kind of moody teenagers, and
Yeah,
seeing them leave with this newfound confidence at the end of a sort of 2-year treatment plan, and they've gone from a bag of chips to a perfect occlusion, and you've done a great job, and they know you've done a great job, and that's for me, that's it, because all the other things we can kind of do, but that's really, I think, what drives me on, to keep doing that every day. Because
fantastic.
there's so many boring stuff in every job, and we do a lot of boring stuff too. But when you get that, that's amazing for me. I like that.
Fantastic. So it comes down to that individual patient experience. That's great. That is great. I
Yeah.
think sometimes we do get caught up with the nuances, right? We get caught up with the either the biomechanics or TADS or something else, which is kind of very interesting. I expect you to say something else if I'm honest, Grant. I expect it to be something like TADS, something like aligners, but it's
Yeah.
interesting that it boils down to that one-on-one, between you and that patient. Interesting. I didn't expect that.
Mm.
Um, how do you keep up to date now? So now, of course, you've kind of left the formal textbooks, so you're now in the big wild west. How do you keep up with things in orthodontics?
I think for me, it's just a lot of it's online. Journals that come through the post. Um, a lot of the odd podcast, a lot of webinars. COVID and the kind of lockdown and things just has meant that I had a lot of free time, and so I kind of wanted to do something. I caught up on all the CPD, but I watched a lot of webinars, and actually I learned a hell of a lot during that time. So webinars, and I know you're going to laugh at this because obviously we've sort of come together through Instagram. But when you're looking at other cases from around the world, some people do things that are a bit different to what I do, to what we do in the UK, and it's great and it works, and it's just a little bit different. But I think we can sort of that's a really good way for learning, to broaden your learning really. And of course, there's conferences and things like that. We've obviously not had a conference for a while, but yeah, I'm planning on doing that too. So to answer your question, journals, webinars, and seeing cases online through things like Instagram
Hmm.
really is the way that I stay up to date, and sort of just exploring stuff online.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? I think that the books and the textbooks, and even sometimes the journals to a degree, they answer some part of a clinical question, right?
Hmm.
But to get the overall picture or the overall journey, and I think we are the human nature is just to learn through that story, and it's partly why I really love these interviews, and I thank you again, Grant, for joining us. Is that story of a clinical case? because we know there's been a time that's taken and how the story's progressed as a consequence. I think we all learn from that story, whether it's a good story or a bad story. We've still got something out of that story, whether or not we want to retell it or whether we want to tell it in our own way. I think it's great. And Instagram stories, of course, helps. Right, Grant. So let's get into some other questions.
Okay.
NHS and private. So you work both in the public sector as well in the private sector.
Yeah.
Where do you stand? Which one would you choose?
Which one would I choose? Well, I don't know if I could nail it down to one or the other. I do like both. I really do like both. When you see NHS cases, you see quite a lot of, you see cases that you really know that you can make a life-changing sort of impact on. When you see private cases and you see a sort of 2 millimeter contact point discrepancy and that's killing them, and you just think, well, that's kind of easy, and it becomes more about other things. At the moment, I see approximately, I worked this out, about 15% NHS sort of is my split, and the rest of it's private. And I love them both. I honestly do love them both. When you see NHS cases, I find that the patients aren't necessarily as good at doing things like wearing elastics or doing what they're meant to, because often they're 12 years old and just don't. But when you have a private patient, you tell them to do something, they do it, and it really works. And often they kind of overdo it sometimes. And it's about finding that kind of balance and knowing who you're talking to and how motivated they are. So I wouldn't say one or the other. I love both. They both bring different things, their own challenges, I suppose. But I get a lot out of them both. Really, really, love the private stuff too, because you can do stuff privately that is amazing. A lot of aligner cases, for example, is one of the things that NHS cases don't allow you to do. TADs as well. You can just do a lot really with private treatment that you can't do NHS necessarily. So yeah, I would say both.
It's great. So therefore, you're getting a large. You're essentially getting the full range of clinical cases, and then you're able to use potentially different clinical tools to resolve those clinical cases. That's a wonderful way to be. I think not even at the beginning of somebody's career, but going forwards, because then you can develop in both of those strategies.
Yeah, and at the moment, I'm doing cases that are things like a hybrid cases. I might have aligners on the top, I might have fixed on the bottom, for example. Just doing different things. I might choose, for example, to put fixed on and try and align everything, then move into aligners. I'm using TADs with aligners. I'm doing sort of bog standard upper lower fix if the case is right. It's really, for me, about get the diagnosis right, nail that, and then figure out what you need to do, and then use the tool that's best for that. I think where our GDPs, and if you have to nail it down to sort of a particular group of conditions, if they can only do one thing, that's what they always do. But I think as specialists, we should use the tool that's best for doing that job, not necessarily just doing one thing, because that's what we can do. You see what I mean? So yeah,
Very
I
good.
like everything.
Grant, let's get on to the meat of this conversation. What football team do you support?
I support Man United.
Oh, damn it.
Yeah.
I had a feeling.
What team do you support?
I support Manchester City, Grant.
Oh, no way.
I support Manchester City. I was born in Manchester. I have an allegiance to the soil on the ground, and it's Manchester City of where I from.
Oh, wow.
But the fact that you support Manchester United is, it's sad.
Let me tell you why that was. In 1996, my first game of football that I watched on TV was Man United Liverpool, and Eric Cantona scored a goal, and since then that's why. So yeah.
Fine. And how's that received back in Scotland? Because I know you're from Glasgow.
Honestly, I think most people in Scotland have like an English team. So they'll kind of have the Scottish team, the Glasgow team, and then they'll have an English team. And it's quite funny because when you're sort of our age, obviously Man United were winning a lot. And then when I look at all my friends' younger brothers,
Yeah.
The boys that are maybe about sort of 20, 25 now, they all support Chelsea because that was
Yes.
the Jose Mourinho era. And then if you
Yeah.
look at the younger sort of their younger brothers, they all support Man City because they've all sort of come good. So um,
Yes.
it's funny, isn't
It is, but also, I mean, it reinforces the fact that I made the right decision. Right. So, Grant,
it?
what is your choice? What is your favorite, Mac or Windows? Where do you stand?
Oh, Mac all
Good
day
man.
long, every
Excellent.
time. Yeah, they just work quick.
Uh,
They work.
couldn't argue with that. Now, of course, the time that you qualified, 2019, then we hit the pandemic very shortly after, as a year following that. So, kind of in someone who's just qualified, I really want to know, how did a pandemic affect you, and how did you manage that situation?
I think it affected me in a couple of different ways. I was desperate for a holiday. I hadn't been on a holiday for a long time. So for me, I literally had a holiday booked. So I was really looking forward to it. And then the pandemic hit. So I was just like, great, now I've got a 3 month holiday. So that was good in some ways. Um, Personally, I think when it comes to career in orthodontics, I honestly just sort of had the time to explore other things. So I was looking at courses, I was looking at webinars, I was looking at stuff that was based around ortho. It wasn't just strictly ortho. Um, Things like restorative cases and joint cases online. And I was watching some, things from around the world all the time, and it was quite. I mean, it was great for that. Um, I think I learned a lot during that time. It was really good, and I caught up on the CPD, which was great. Because I think we always forget that, and we sort of rushing around at the last minute. And
Mm,
it was really good for my learning, actually, lockdown and having that break. When it came to treating cases, obviously everything stopped. And then what I had to do was I had to go through all my list of patients, prioritize, which ones are important, which ones, can I afford to just leave for a bit. Um, Emergencies were sort of filtering through to me. I had to triage them, talk to my bosses. It just wasn't as easy as just sort of, close the door and then open the door back up again and everyone comes back in. So I mean, it was challenging. And at that time, I was still working in Manchester, so I had to drive to Manchester to see the odd emergency with all the gowns and masks and everything, and then come home again. Um, and yeah, it was challenging from that perspective too.
it was. It was. But it's good that you took such a positive spin to that time as well, and further yourself from that learning. That was wonderful to hear. Um, at this stage, Grant, you're 2 years qualified. What challenges do you see in your career going forwards?
Um, I think for me and my career as such, it's probably I work a lot, 5 6 days sometimes, and I think having a balance is key. Um, in terms of challenges, obviously we have to get better at the things that we feel that we're not good at and being honest with ourselves. So for me, we had no aligner teaching. I've had to go out and I've had to learn it off someone who's a massive provider of um, aligners in the UK, and so I soaked up all that knowledge. You can't get taught that; no one will teach you that. You just got to go out there and you've just got to corner someone and soak it all up. So I've done that. So um, that was a challenge, but going forward, I think just constantly progressing. Um, for me, I want to use a lot more TADs in my cases. I think that would be great, and I've seen some of the results of them, and I think really useful tool to have in your back pocket, really. So constantly getting out there and trying to learn as much as you can and not get lazy. That's
Mm,
really sort of the big challenge.
yeah, and it's interesting to see that kind of time during COVID enabled you to get that connection to other learning, and allowed you to connect to knowledge which was perhaps not conventional knowledge to acquire. It's somewhere else in the world, somewhere else, and kept you connected as a consequence. That's interesting. So your notion of the challenge is to stay connected to orthodontics in a broader sense. That's interesting. Grant, so who is it, looking at now your career and the people who have influenced you as to where you got to today, who is it you admire the most in orthodontics?
Do you know what? When you sent these questions through, I didn't know. I honestly don't know. I've had great teachers. I've had a couple of really nice ones. I
Yes.
think for me, my current boss is someone that I admire a lot. He's just about to retire now. Sometimes, we think we're good, and we think we know a lot, and we think we've got something absolutely nailed. And we talk to someone else, and my boss is just about to retire now, and he just says one thing, and it just completely changes what you were thinking, or what they're coming from a completely different angle. That kind of generation, if you want to call them that, I'm incredible at bending wire. So for them, that's like, incredible. And that's something that, I definitely want to get better at. But just when it comes to different treatment considerations, he's been great. When it comes to life advice, business advice, anything like that, for a lot of different reasons, I would probably say my current boss. And I think, we can learn a lot from looking at the old school. Because I think that ortho, yes, all this new stuff works and it works really well, but so does all the old stuff. And actually, it stood the test of time, and people still do old school stuff today, and it worked really well. So why change? And I think for me, I like to take some things from the old school and some things from the modern day, and then try and combine them and use a bit of both. And that's really useful for me.
It's interesting you've got that insight, Grant, because it can be that you qualify and you think, actually, now I know orthodontics, and it's everything in today and in social media and in something contemporary. Actually, the textbooks are now in the confines of history, but actually, tooth movement took place back in the day as well, and it did used to get excellent clinical results. So it's not that you have to be using all the today's armamentarium to be able to treat a case well. And actually, I think ultimately it comes down to the skill of the clinician rather than necessarily these individual products that come out. Grant, to finish with, what one piece of advice would you give to the orthodontists out
there? I would honestly say to look through photos. At the moment, I'm compiling a massive sort of huge big database of photos, and I don't know, when you were training, you would just sort of take photos of everything because you had to for exams. Now, in ortho, we have to get a year and a half to the very end before we make that learning point. We take away that learning point. Oh, I could have done this, or that didn't quite go so well, or maybe I'll try this next time. But you kind of forget that because it's a year and a half ago that you've made that decision. You just kind of think, oh well, So looking through your photos, being critical, striving for better outcomes. Don't be lazy when it comes to your finishing. Just think, oh, it's okay, I'm just going to settle in. I think as well, looking at other sort of clinicians in the area, don't scrimp on anchorage reinforcement. I think it's really, it can be easy just to think sort of, okay, it's a bit of an overjet, I'll just take out upper floors and I'll just crash it back, and I'll not make a TP, for example. That's quite an easy thing to do. Whereas to do it properly might take a bit longer, it might be, be a bit more hassle, it might be a bit more expensive, but you know what? The result's probably going to be better. And I think my piece of advice would be to look through photos, to not be lazy when it comes to anchorage reinforcement. And finally, the biggest one for me, as has actually been to make an Instagram page, because there's been, for me, no better way of improving all aspects of the care that I give than putting photos online for the world to see and to judge. And your standards will rocket if you have to do that for all of your cases. And so now I think to myself, people are going to see this. This has to be right. And that for me has been a big thing. So it's worked for me. That's the three bits of advice I suppose I'll give to the orthodontist.
That's excellent, Grant. Thank you so much for joining me on Orthodontics in Interview. And guys, I've got to say, looking at Grant's cases, they are incredible, the ones that he's published so far. Very much puts somebody like myself, who's now 6 years qualified, absolutely to shame. And at Anchorage loss, he's probably talking about one of my cases that he saw. So I think, guys, please look up Grant at ISHERWOOD on Instagram, have a look at his cases. Grant, I think what I've heard from you today is a guy who's not only well clinically driven and academically driven, but also you've got the skill there as well. And I think you're definitely one to watch for 2022 and going forwards. It's so interesting to hear some of your advice. It resembles what Neil Kravitz said, and he's a well-experienced clinician from the States. He described photos as being a key aspect of learning. And I think from yourself and the generation of orthodontists coming through, if that is instilled, then we will all be better at producing our clinical results. Thank you so much for your time, Grant.
No problem. Thanks for having me again. Thank you.
Next is the outtake from my interview with Grant ISHERWOOD. Grant, I can see you didn't like my last post on Facebook. Can you just explain to the listeners why that was?
It's probably because it was so boring.
Grant, honest to God, we are no longer friends.
Sorry.